Activism has become a powerful force in contemporary art, fighting for the climate, democracy, justice, and many, many more. Today, we will ask questions like, how does the tether between activism and art institutions look like?
We will speak about this topic with a focus on the question, what is the impact of activism? Welcome to Art Institutions in the Age of Existential Risks.
Today, we are discussing with artists, activists, and a filmmaker which role museums play in activism. What can be changed in order to turn museums into allies advocating for carbon neutrality and human rights? Can we unite to tackle the existential risks of our time? And what can art institutions learn from activist movements? The conversations will be followed by a film screening of Dear Future Children. Artists and activists have criticized art institutions all over the world for being sponsored by oil companies, such as the Dutch activist group Fossil Free Culture NL. Thanks to the group's public actions, culture institutions in Amsterdam don't depend on fossil fuel money anymore. However, some UK institutions, such as the British Museum, have still not managed to completely cut ties with the oil and gas company British Petrol. Even though if the majority of British institutions signed a declaration of a climate emergency and a commitment to no longer accept fossil fuel money. Many institutions worldwide have not drawn the link between the refusal of oil money and climate change concerns yet. Some are not even willing to speak about the ethics of sponsorship at all.
The protest movement, BP or not BP, calls British cultural institutions out on being sponsored by the oil giant BP. We have a representative of BP or not BP among us today. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So Mustafa Bayr is based in London and works as a visual researcher, journalist and art activist. Moreover, he is a facilitator of evolutionary changes of perspectives within the cultural sector, and he challenges the imperial condition of Western art galleries and museums through advocacy and boycott. So Bayram now will take us to one of BP or not BP's most relevant fields of action. Let's travel to London.
Hi there, my name is Mustafa Bayr, and currently I'm in front of the British Museum, as you can see. And you might be wondering what I'm actually doing here. Well, before I answer that question, I would like to go back to 2016 and my first day in London. As a Turkish immigrant living in the UK, from the moment I came here, I knew that I would love to work in the cultural sector. I remember my first day thinking how I would like to do anything to work in Tate Modern while scrolling around. Well, my dreams came true, kind of. After 2 years, I was employed as a front of house staff and worked for Tate. During that time, I saw Leonard Blavatnik's building plastered everywhere across the museum. That was very strange to me and puzzling, because I knew that Blavatnik was an oil oligarch while still giving a lot of money to arts and culture across the UK. Even though I knew that staff and unions do hold power in changing the way museums make their decisions in relation to sponsorship, I knew that I had to join a grassroots organization to pressure cultural institutions from the outside to break their links with fossil fuel companies. What got me involved with BP or not BP, a protest group that demand cultural institutions must break their links with fossil fuel industries, was that as well. As a group, we think that oil-sponsored institutions are ideal venues to provoke a wider public conversation about the destructive activities of the fossil fuel industry and to amplify the voices of those who are affected by them. Over the last few years, we have organized various protests in the British Museum. We have facilitated stolen goods tours and invaded the Great Court of the British Museum for more than 3 days, demanding that BP sponsorship must be dropped. What is very troubling about this sponsorship is that as we need to transition from and away from fossil fuel, and this change becomes more and more urgent, we see that oil companies such as BP's are proving to be powerful stumbling blocks on the path to zero carbon world. BP made the third biggest contribution to climate change of any company in the history, and their sponsorship with the British Museum is horrendous. BP actually uses sponsorship of culture to maintain and enhance what is known as social license to operate in order to continue pursuing high-risk drilling projects and fueling global climate change. This social license comes from fostering the belief among key audiences, especially socially political elites, that BP is a legitimate and socially responsible company. BP needs to appear as a good citizen, doing its bit for the cultural life in the UK in order to counteract the increasing bad press its activities around the world are attracting. Art sponsorship has proven to be a cheap and effective means of burnishing its image. Just 2 hours of BP profits in 2016 would have covered its sponsorship of Tate. It also comes with an added benefit of accessing iconic British institutions for corporate events and political networking. This is why I think that the British Museum should stop art washing the image of the British Petroleum. BP's payments represent only 1% of the annual income of these cultural institutions, in some cases significantly less than 1%, as the British Museum here. Cuts in art funding and pro-corporate sponsorship policies of various cultural institutions are certainly putting pressure on these museums to form alliances with corporations such as BP. However, the small group of organizations that BP chooses to fund tend to be those with highest existing profiles and fundraising ability. Oil companies only fund cultural institutions where they have a strategic interest, events where they can gain maximum exposure and kudos, or arts in areas where they have a specific local or regional interest in keeping the public on their side. Oil money is not distributed based on where the arts are most in need, but on where the interest of these corporations best can be served.
Thanks, Bayram, for taking us to one of the most relevant fields of action of BP or not BP and giving us an insight in your work. It's wonderful to have you here today, so we can learn more about the ethics on sponsorship, but also on your ideas on community engagement in relationship to art institutions. So I actually would love to begin with a question, how are you affected by artistic practices and how does art touch you?
Yes, so I was always interested in being an artist in any shape or form, and when I came to the UK as an immigrant, I studied art in an art university as well. So for me it was very important knowing that I will be showing that art. These kinds of cultural institutions that I engage with are actually not promoting oil companies and fossil fuel companies, who are actually one of the reasons why we are in a climate crisis currently. And being a Gen Z, I know that if I actually don't do anything about it, if I engage with cultural institutions who are promoting the greenwashing of these companies, my art doesn't have any sort of a value. I feel like I am co-opting in some sort of a way to a dynamic that actually enables these big companies to operate and to do more extraction and oil production that actually leads to our destruction in the world.
So you actually mentioned in your video statement the term art watching, which describes the use of art and artists in a positive way to distract from or to legitimize negative actions by an individual, organization, country or government. So how does oil sponsorship in the cultural sector exemplify the concept of art washing, and do art institutions actually benefit from such collaborative practices?
So if we look in instance in the case of the British Museum, we can really see that actually the specific exhibitions that BP sponsor, they are related to specific countries where they have interest, and that interest manifests in their ideas and beliefs that actually they want to extract more in these countries. For example, if we look in one of their recent exhibition, which was named Troy Myth and Reality, it was during the 2019 when BP just finished the Trans-Anatolian pipeline, which goes over various Kurdish villages, and in most of the time, these Kurdish villages were destroyed, and the Turkish government actually didn't repatriate the people who lived in these villages for the land lost. So in the end of the day, we see how BP actually promotes this form of cultural heritage and showing of cultural heritage through exhibitions such as Troy, which is current day Turkey, while at the same time engages in environmental racism, especially in places like Turkey, in Egypt, in Iraq, and in Mexico as well. And if we look specifically on the timeline of BP projects around the world, we will actually see that they at the same time are sponsoring exhibitions that are actually highlighting the cultural heritage of these countries. Another example would be that they use the private openings of these events to gather around and have big political actors come in and have their parties and use these places of culture and institutions to lobby the government to give them actually more money and more permission to extract more oil and fossil fuels. So I believe that art washing in its bigger sense is not just about the fact that me as an artist will come to an institution and I will feel uncomfortable about showing my work there because it's sponsored by a oil giant, but at the same time, this institution actually, in a way, enables these companies to extract more and lead us to a global destruction.
So BP or not BP is an example of how policies of art institutions are influenced by public response from the inside as well as from the outside. What's your vision of the role that communities can play in reforming institutions?
So for this, again, from my personal background as a cultural worker in museums, I really believe that actually staff members and employees can really influence how the governance of museums will take place and what are the decisions that will be taken high above. And we can see that in the case of us working with the PCS union particularly, which is the trade union that represents front of house staff in the British Museum. We engaged with them on a regular basis, and during our action in 2019, when we occupied the museum for 3 days, actually the union membership has put out a statement saying that they actually support our movement and they demand that the British Museum drop BP. But at the same time, I believe that that kind of pressure from the inside is most of the time very instrumental. Museum workers are allowed to say and do and act upon various calls, knowing that at some point there will be a flashback against them. So I really believe that grassroots organizations play a very huge role in taking forward and being bolder and being more loud about this. And basically, in a way, we are changing the political, not the political, but the public landscape of what this sponsorship really means.
So you were speaking that as I understand you, that BP can kind of function, or BP or not BP, can kind of function as an advisor to institutions. Did I understand this correctly? And if I understood it correctly, could you maybe elaborate on this a little bit more? So do you think it's important to create some kind of dialogue between activist movements as well as the art institution? And could activist movements function as an advisor to institutions?
I don't, it's a very tricky question in my opinion, because as activists, we want to stay as activists. Obviously, our goal is not to be activists anymore, for our demands to be taken forward by the museums, and our initial goal, which would be that all cultural institutions in the UK should drop oil sponsorship. If that is achieved, there is no point of having BP or not BP, and that is our goal. We don't want to be in a constant state of being active and being present and demanding and organizing. And what I think it's really important here as an activist group, we really believe that sometimes we can facilitate conversations and we can bring to the table different voices that are most of the time not heard. And these voices are most of the time from the global South. So if we think, I don't really think that our goal is to be advisory, but we can think of ways that we can connect different local activists from around the globe to institutions such as the British Museum, and that kind of conversation that will be facilitated by groups and activists like us will, in a way, form some kind of deeper connection and deeper understanding of the different ways the museums can actually be socially engaged and have a socially engaged practice as well.
That kind of fits to my next question, because you, as far as we know, you were researching fundamental ideas and approaches behind community-based institutions, namely in Malaysia. So how exactly do you think such ideas and concepts could help to reform institutions worldwide?
Yeah, totally. So I usually think of this as like the art utopia. And if we think what is an art utopia, we think that that's an imaginary space where we would never actually achieve to go to. It's something that is perfect, and it's something that is already something that we are striving for. And I think I really base my values around that and my research on the fact that actually this is a very Western-centric way of thinking about what museums actually can be. And if we think about art utopia, I would like to base that on the idea of what actually indigenous communities and local communities all around the world, how they are setting up museums. And if I go to one specific example, that would be the example of a community center in Malaysia, and it's called Orang Seletar Community Center, where there was where the land of this small cultural village was actually encroached by private developers for a commercial waterfront development. And what the villagers did at the time was that they actually initiated a court case against the development, and they won the court case. And basically, after the court case was won, the village became a cultural village and became a museum eventually. But not only that, the idea of the museum was not that we will be able to showcase our culture as an indigenous community. They actually got the government to repatriate money for the land lost of the villagers as well during the development of the waterfront. So what I'm saying there is, like, on the West, we always say, in a way, most of the time, think of how we can influence, how we can, from the inside out, think of ways of reforming museums. But if we look at different perspectives all across the globe, we see how people, communities, and community-based projects are coming together in a way to actually fight this commercialized way of destroying the land we live in. And I think this is like a very interesting way of thinking about our activism and the activism of indigenous communities as well, because we see that we are fighting against the British Petroleum to be sponsoring art, where indigenous-led communities that are setting up cultural centers, they are taking different ways of different climate-related problems, and they're using socially engaged practice in creating museums to even not so only to
not enable the government to greenwash the image of a particular brand, but also to repatriate different resources that were lost.
So you are speaking about community engagement, and I'm wondering, because I feel like the current development in also how those big art events like the Documenta or the biennials all around the world are kind of structures, are kind of getting more and more community oriented. So the upcoming Documenta, it will focus on, or it will be curated by Juan Grupa, for instance, so an artist collective. Do you think this is the development in which curatorial practices should go?
I think it's a positive change. I wouldn't say it's perfect, and I wouldn't say it's going to change. I would say it's an incremental change. I think when we are thinking about community-based practice, we really need to strip back a bit and not use the general ways of operating and governance in museums. So why we just don't take a bit of time to slow down before going over and thinking we are doing the right thing, and engage in just community research, like and community outreach. And again, there is another perspective here, which is like an example. The Anacosta Museum in Washington. It was established in 1960s, and the main idea of the museum was that it would be a neighborhood museum. It would only have 5 to 10 employees, and it would be managed by the neighborhood. So during the initial implementation of the mission statement of the museum, they hired the board of trustees, around 30 of them, not like 5 that we usually see in Western museums, and all the board of trustees were actually people from the neighborhood. The next stage of the development of the mission statement for the museum was actually that they would embark on a big research of what the actual neighborhood needs. So they would do this huge outreach of the neighborhood, and they would collect opinions. And the second action after that would be to ask the museum staff of how they see the museum take place in future, what kind of exhibitions and what kind of curations there should be in the museum. And the last part of the outreach was towards artists that they would like to engage with. And these artists don't have to be artists that are well established, but it can be community-based art groups, or like people from the neighborhood who would like to create art as well. So I think we need to roll back and slow back a bit and try to think of ways how we can actually engage without actually using formal ways of curation, and thinking how we can engage more audiences by just engaging with more community-based practice without actually implementing it in the governance of the museums.
Yeah, this really reminds me of this concept of slow curating, actually, that I think becomes more and more important. So you also speak about the Green New Deal and the Cultural New Deal in your work. And for me, it would be interesting to hear more about the intersection between both of them.
Yes, totally. I see that we live in a culture of destruction and exploitation. And we can look at it in 2 different ways, in the ways, especially in how that manifests in museums. A lot of museums currently are undergoing a lot of changes in the way they operate to be greener in response to the climate crisis. But another way of thinking how museums and cultural institutions promote culture of destruction and division is how we see that they're most of the time promoting white artists and white body of staff and white body of trustees as well. So there is actually no way of museums engaging in the broader sense of cultural equity and cultural justice. And what I mean by that, when we intersect these 2 things, we realize that the cultural division is that is promoted by institutions is everywhere, and it intersects with the idea of like how the climate crisis is mostly affected by people in the global south and indigenous communities. And most of the time, people who are asking for their heritage to be brought back to them from institutions such as the British museums are, again, people in the global South, people in Nigeria, people in Iraq, and all across the world who are bearing the burdens of colonialism and imperialism. So I believe that institutions and cultural institutions are a perfect place to understand how we can promote green ideals and green future at the same time, while we are understanding how we can unlearn and undo the destructive past of imperialism.
How do you actually envision the future of the museum sector?
Firstly, I envision it as without fossil fuel sponsorship. That would be a great start. Another thing that I think it's very important is, again, going back to the idea of art utopia. Actually, we need to slow back and think of ways we can invite people from the communities whose stolen objects we are displaying. Instead of inviting them as tokens, we need to invite them as being part of a counter expedition of imperialism that will help us unlearn the ways we are succumbing to this idea of cultural division. So the way I envision the future of museum is led by indigenous communities, in facilitation and co-creation of indigenous communities. And at the same time, I view the future of museums as community-oriented, in a way that they seek out and proactively are doing proactive outreach campaigns to the neighborhood and the community around the museum as well.
So now we are coming to our last question. Is there anything in particular that you would like to tell art institutions?
So what I would say to art institutions is that I think they hold a lot of power, and most of the time they present themselves as they don't have a lot of power. And what I would like cultural institutions to embrace more is that power, and go away of the idea of neutrality, that they are neutral spaces that represent the history and the heritage of the world. There are places where vital discussions about the future of the world can take place. And that discussions do not need to be neutral. And that type of discussions always hold some kind of power dynamics between different actors. So I would like museums and cultural institutions to embrace that stance of being imperfect.
That's tremendously fascinating, I think, and very important to note. So thank you so much for your work and your engagement, Bayram. It has been a tremendous pleasure to have you with us, and yeah, I'm looking forward to keep up our conversations.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for everybody listening.
Fighting for feminist and equal rights looks different all over the world. Presenting this fight in public space means both visibility and vulnerability. In South Asia, women are protesting against gender-based violence, creating murals that are an act of performing politics, arts, and activism. By empowering women and the queer community in South Asia, they are tackling issues of marginalized communities. They demand environmental and social justice for their countries.
I now have the pleasure to introduce to you Shilo Shiv Suleman, an internationally renowned creator, founder, and director of the artist activist group, The Fearless Collective. Shilo's public practices are at the borderline of art and social activism, with a focus on resistance of South Asian women and the queer community against harassment, violence, and homophobia. Shilo ignites conversations on difficult topics through the language of art, beauty, and unity. She has sent us a video statement, so let's see where she takes us.
My name is Shilo Shiv Suleman, and I'm the founder and director of The Fearless Collective. Fearless began in 2012, following the gang rape of a 21-year-old girl called Jyoti Singh Pandey on the streets in India. And I went to my first ever protest, and there was rage, and there was power, and there was magic, as all of us had gathered there, thousands of us on the streets, really talking about gender-based violence in India and how it affected not just this one girl, but all of us in our own homes. And while we had our fists raised up in the sky by day, at night we would sit together at the pavements and we would talk about our own stories, these almost silent wounds that so many women had carried with them. And as we would speak to each other, there was a healing, there was an alchemy, there was a softness in the way that we were telling our own stories beside each other's bodies. And that was somehow missing from a lot of the mainstream narratives that we were hearing in the newspapers, which told you don't walk out onto the street because you will get raped, don't jump onto a bus because you will get raped. It felt like the fear was absolutely counterproductive, not only to the change that we needed to see, but also to the healing that needed to occur. And so Fearless began as a flood. It began as a viral online campaign of hundreds of women across India representing their own stories in completely fearless ways. And since then, it's growing into a movement of now hundreds of artists across South Asia who are reclaiming public spaces from fear. The way that we work is with communities in extremely participative workshops. So we have developed a 7-step methodology through which communities represent their own bodies in their own spaces. Very often, people who are on the margins, be it communities of Syrian refugees or transgender women or sex workers or even just women who've experienced some kind of violence, have their stories be told for them by somebody else. And so we actually revert that process by allowing communities to represent themselves in ways that they want to be seen. And what we find as we're working with those communities, asking them how they want to be seen, how they want to be made visible as public monuments in different spaces, we find that there's usually enough room to be able to hold both the trauma as well as the transcendence of those communities. So we have worked on over 40 murals in over 15 countries, ranging from working with indigenous communities in Brazil, reclaiming sites that were colonized, all the way up to working in Pakistan in spaces that are affected by gang violence and some of the most unsafe neighborhoods in Pakistan, to Shaheen Bagh, and most recently we were at COP26 representing indigenous communities in a crucial conversation around climate justice. So when we think about how we can start to bring in more of this open, accessible approach that I think a lot of public art has to art institutions. I think, you know, in spaces like India, art was not separate from life. We didn't have gallery spaces. Art was embedded into the walls, it was embedded into our weapons, our utensils. And what's happened with a more colonial and Western approach is that art has somehow become separate from life. Its beauty has been separated from day-to-day living. And I think something that art institutions need to think about a little bit is how can we start to actually bridge that binary and that gap to be able to see art really permeate in conversations around social and environmental justice, to see art really become part of our daily lived experience again. When we're actually painting on the streets, the way that we paint is not in fear, or it's not like we go and we spray paint something and we run away. We actually, when we're working with the community, we are fearlessly reclaiming that space and occupying that space with the community. So over 7 days, we'll be out in the streets of, say, Jaipur, Rajasthan, working with the community, engaging in conversations. And what we find when we work in that way is that every bystander, every policeman, every auntie that walks by, the mafia, the gangsters that come by, everybody has space to have an open dialogue, which is because of also, I think, the transcendental nature of creating beauty, of the music, the joy, the poetry that we bring into those spaces. There's an ability to be able to see beyond one's own story. And what we really believe is when people's stories start to expand, then public opinion expands. When public opinion expands, then eventually policies, governments have no chance but to catch up. So that's the way that Fearless currently operates. Most recently, our work was at COP26 in Glasgow. While a lot of our work is situated in the global south, every now and then we do also bring a different kind of voice to the global north. Now, as democrats, world leaders, diplomats sat together in conference halls at Glasgow, making crucial decisions about the fate of the entire planet, we decided to bring together another kind of voice that has been historically marginalized. So we worked with indigenous leaders from Brazil, from Guyana, from Peru, from North America, whose ways of being, whose ways of living with the earth have never been woven into conversations around the climate crisis. And we stood on the streets and we made one of the first few testaments to the indigenous community and their own sovereignty. The way that we work is, like I said, we do these very immersive workshops with different communities where we ask them how they want to be seen. And in this particular conversation, speaking with indigenous leaders, the first representation that came up was one where indigenous leaders and people were taking care of the earth, were tending to the earth, were watering plants, were planting seeds. And then we said that is an image that we usually see, right? We see images of indigenous communities who are constantly tending to the earth while everybody else does whatever the hell they want. And so we decided perhaps there's another kind of image that we can have instead. The second image that came up as an option in the workshop was an image of resistance, of strength, of a fist raised up in the sky, demarcate the land. But that also is an image that we see a lot of indigenous communities these days, constantly in struggle, constantly resisting. So instead, the conversation became about sovereignty and representing these people as leaders of their own nations that have continued to be unrecognized after colonization. And we created an image of a Brazilian man and a Peruvian woman, completely sovereign, almost like the king and queen of a nation. And it says, bow down, honor your roots. Which particularly at Market Square in Glasgow, which was a hub of all the colonial activity, it really was the space where all of the trade was happening. It became a very powerful reclamation. All across the streets in the world and in parks in the world, we see images of Queen Victoria, who was not our queen. And so for us to actually place the image of indigenous leaders in that space was a very radical act of reclamation. And also move the conversation away from the very patronizing, fear-based approach around climate change, save the earth, save the tiger, save the planet, to a reverence which was missing from a lot of the conversations in COP26, a space of love and respect and reverence for the climate and the world. When we create our work, we aren't just representing communities as they are, but as they want to be. And so we all often say that the fearless murals are portals to that safe and sacred future that we want to live in. What's very interesting in these conversations around self-representation is very often when we're working with the community, the images that emerge are completely different from what we initially imagined. Like, for example, we were working with a community of domestic migrant workers in Beirut, in Lebanon, who'd all fled war, fled war in Syria, fled war in Sudan, and had come to Lebanon seeking a better life, but ended up finding themselves entangled in a web of domestic work and a very repressive kafala system. And when we asked them how they wanted to be represented, again, the first few images that came up were images of resistance, power, struggle. But then another image emerged, which was a Sri Lankan woman who was a domestic migrant worker, a Sudanese woman and a Syrian woman lying down and drinking a cup of tea. And the reason why we ended up painting that mural was because they spoke about how in the future they don't want to work the way that they don't want to struggle, they don't want to resist, but they actually want a life of ease. And so the entire conversation there became about the right to rest and the right to also have that ease in their own life. And the mural itself says, my existence is an act of resistance, and sits in Marrakech in Beirut. What was interesting is that after the bomb blast, while a lot of the buildings around that area were completely destroyed, that mural still continues to exist as an act of resistance and a reminder that perhaps some of these communities can have access to a life of ease and rest. In terms of the future of art institutions and the transformation of art institutions, in India and spaces in the global south, art has never been separate from life. We didn't have separate gallery spaces that were dedicated to beauty. Beauty was embedded in everything from our buildings, to our weapons, to our utensils, to the fabric that we wore on our body, to the poetry that we recited with our tongues. And that is, I think, a shift, and almost a decolonial shift, that I think a lot of art institutions need to make, where there isn't a separation between high art and fine art, and art that exists for the community and art that exists for social change. It all actually participates in the same safe and sacred future that we want to create. And so I think One way is to definitely start to move beyond the binaries of classification and start to find a space where all kinds of art is treated with the same kind of equality. I also think that participative art is most definitely something that art institutions need to start thinking about a little bit more seriously, because there is a way that people can also shape the way that they want to be seen, which I think a lot of art infrastructure doesn't necessarily take into account. And I think most importantly, I think art institutions need to recognize and reconcile how artists are actually often the most unabashed and therefore the most at risk. Most recently, we've been working with an artist from Afghanistan as well as an artist from Burma, who both had to flee the military coup as well as the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan pretty much overnight. And we did a beautiful piece of work with them in Paris, in France, where we brought both these girls together and created a mural on the streets of Paris, speaking to their homelands. And what we found is, especially while the pandemic has been an emergency for everybody, in some spaces the emergency is often amplified by unstable governments, by things that are by gender-based violence, and so I think for art institutions there is a responsibility to be able to protect artists who are making their voices most heard.
Looking for new solutions of living, working and deliberating peacefully is often part of working at the intersection of art and activism. Solidarity, practiced and enacted in art performances, can be a starting point for change in societal structures. Art has the potential to envision alternative futures which can initiate actual steps towards change. A future that can be imagined might become reality.
Lucy Orta is an internationally renowned artist, professor, and chair of art and the environment at London College of Fashion. As a pioneer of sustainable design, her work lies in the borderland between fashion, visual art, and activism. She was part of several projects focusing on coexistence and community building to fight against injustice and climate crisis. Futuristic utopian scenarios and aspects of collaboration have always played a great part in her project. Lucy has sent us a video message. Let's visit her in her studio in Paris.
Hello, I'm Lucy Orta. I'm half of the Studio Orta, that is Lucy and Jorge Orta, and I'm here today in my Paris-based studio. And behind me, you can see some fragments of our Antarctica project, Antarctic World Village and the Antarctica flag. The Antarctica project was a project that Jorge had been dreaming of since his representation of the Venice Biennale in 1995. And it's built on the premise of the Antarctic Treaty, the first major peace treaty to be signed after the Cold War in 1957, which unites nations around common values, those of peace and of cooperation. We actually installed the Antarctic Village on the Antarctic continent in 2007. So it took us over 15 years to realise this project. And it was important for us to be present, to have that experience, that extreme experience of installing this village, and to actually make the groundings, give the foundations to this project. It wasn't enough to just announce it. We had to be there in Antarctica and feel those extreme conditions to be able to take this project forward. So we installed the village in 2007, and then from 2008 onwards, the village toured in different exhibitions around the world to different museums, the Hangar Bikoka firstly, and the Shanghai Biennial, for example, many more exhibitions. We see Antarctica as a metaphor. It's one of our meta themes. It's a symbol of peace and equity based on the principles of the Antarctic Treaty, those of cooperation amongst peoples, and all arms are banished in Antarctica. So we can strive as a community to work towards these values. What became important after the founding of the Antarctic World Village was this notion of identity. Now, having founded that in Antarctica, what is this world community? How can we create it? So this is where the Antarctic World Passport was born, a passport based on these values of peace and equity. So coming back to this idea of Antarctica as a metaphor, it's one of the greatest symbols of climate change today. And of course, we know that climate change has no borders. Another one of our projects which manifests this notion of solidarity, of connectiveness, is the Nexus Architecture project. Nexus Architecture is a chain of interconnected overalls, clothes that are linked together by a tube from the front to the back of a person. You can get inside the clothes, connect together, and form part of this momentary being. It's really powerful to be connected physically, viscerally, in space, and particularly in the public realm as a force of solidarity. And this was a powerful symbol of the fractured nature of society, of people socially alone, of solitude. More recently, Nexus Architecture has been used as a way to bring young people together to manifest their opinions around the climate emergency, and in particular the collaboration with Glasgow School of Arts and the University of the Arts in London during the COP26 Climate Summit. For the first time, we created a series of blank suits, and those blank canvases were given to the students from Glasgow School of Arts and the University of the Arts London to customise and to manifest their opinions around the climate emergency. The customisation workshops were followed by a mass march through London during the COP26 Climate Summit. Nexus Architecture during COP26 became a very important symbol of our power to come together, a momentary being, a collective wave, a ripple and a chain of solidarity in the coming together of people in this collective series of overalls.
Hi Lucy, thank you very much for joining us and for giving us those impressions on your work. It's fantastic to get some insight in your artistic practices. So greetings to Paris. I hope you are doing all right.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, very well.
So as you link art and activism in your work, you are probably the best person to ask whether you think the connection between those two fields can be made.
Yes, I mean, I'd like to start with perhaps three definitions proposed by the great humanist activist Satish Kumar. And he defines activism as protesting, protecting, and creating new alternatives. And I would say that at Studio Orta, we're especially motivated by that third framework, so creating new alternatives. And also to make this distinction between those, of course, that risk their lives through activist forms of protesting and protecting. So let's focus on this idea of creating new alternatives. And how I guess we interpret this is the capacity that art, the forms that we are making, has to point a finger at injustices around the world, but also to inspire, and particularly in our case, to empower. And with that empowerment, we hope that others will take up action, that this will incite change.
So how can participatory models that have been tested in art institutions starting from the 1960s be applied in protest on the streets and activist movements today?
I'm kind of turning that question around because particularly in our practice, we're really interested in actually forms of protests that can be transformed into new performances, new performative practices. And I can take for the example that the Cacerolazo as you may know, became a popular event where people of all ages and all walks of life beat pots and pans and kitchen utensils, leaning out of their windows and their balconies, investing public space and creating a new and massive form of public activism. And I think this first recorded demonstration of protest happened in Chile in 1971. And the resonating and the beating of kitchenware was actually used to overthrow the Argentine governors in 2001. So, I mean, how can we transform these forms that are so powerful and so democratic into resonating poetic forms to incorporate and build new audiences in the future?
You actually, it's a follow-up question. You actually used the term democratic. Why are those actions actually democratic?
They are democratic because they're reaching out to everybody, irrespective of race, religion, age group, man, woman, sex, gender. And we're particularly interested in these forms that can reach all kinds of different audiences and in a way speak different languages as much as possible and federate people around issues that are important to the wider society, such as the climate emergency.
So we are living in times of existential risks. We are facing pandemics, environmental and climate crisis, and social inequalities. How could this moment lead to an increase in solidarity around the world?
Yes, so we're really coming to terms with the fact that these major risks, such as the climate emergency and the pandemic, are problems that are shared by all of us. And they're going to impact, and they're already impacting in each and every one of us, and they make no distinction whatsoever. And through that, we've finally understood our interconnectedness. And I kind of call this a new ecological awareness, because on the one hand, we're facing the climate crisis and the radical altering of the course of our planet's natural cycles and systems. On the other hand, we know that the pandemic has been caused by wildlife that have been forcefully uprooted from their natural habitats. So this reckoning, the direct impact of human interference or human destruction, is something that all of us have felt in a very personal and a very visceral way over the last year and a half. And the speed at which this has happened has given us an unprecedented opportunity to feel, I think, to feel more engaged and to place us in a natural situation of dialogue and interchange of ideas. And all of this has created this shared transnational, transcultural and apolitical movement in a way, because we're all concerned and we all feel a solidarity towards each other.
In what way could the concept of solidarity that you actually already mentioned and coexistence you present in the Antarctica project be an answer to the moment of existential risks humanity and the planet are facing today?
We're using Antarctica as a symbol. Of course, it's a place that exists, a continent that exists. And we know that it's extremely threatened by climate change. It's one of the first indicators of the melting of the ice caps and the rising of sea levels. The fact that Antarctica, this powerful symbol, is in danger of disappearing is already moving us. We can all see in our minds the ice of Antarctica melting, and we can all imagine how that will impact us. What interested us in Antarctica is the fact that the scientists that are working there are collaborating for the good of humanity, for the good of all peoples. And this notion of cooperation, solidarity, coexistence in this extreme environment, working against all odds, working against the freezing temperatures, working against the extreme conditions, is something that we can all be in awe of and all be completely inspired by.
All right, thank you. So your work has been shown at multiple biennials, like in Venice, in Johannesburg, Havana or Shanghai. What is the possibility for major art events to become new sites of activism in these times of global crisis that we are facing at the moment? And how relevant are they as potential sites for activism?
Yes, they're no doubt that they're incredibly powerful stages, and especially when they're situated outside of the more dominant structures like the Venice Biennale or Kassel. But we have to be mindful of the kinds of audiences that are visiting the biennials and who we want to connect with when we're organizing our artistic activities within these structures. I think where in a sense we've been more successful is in the biennials that are very nascent, that are very new, and it's been absolutely fascinating to connect and develop links with new communities that have been externalized from international events previously. So it's exciting to be able to work within, I would say, outside the auspices of the major events and look towards developing new audiences and new communities.
Could you share some examples? Like, do you have something in mind?
I was thinking particularly of the Nexus architecture action that we were able to set up at the Second Johannesburg Biennial in 1997. And this was the second biennial and the first time that the biennial had taken place in a prominent building in the city of Johannesburg. And next to that was the Workers' Library, a library that had been kept open during the apartheid for, and that being able to create a community event within that library was very poignant and very symbolic in parallel to the other activities of the biennial that were taking place, in a way that we were able to draw in communities that may not have access to those power structures in a way, and allow some kind of fluidity and exchange to take place. I mean, that also took place through the activity of making the Nexus architecture through its symbolic content, the connectedness of building that structure that would then be performed in the public space.
Your multifaceted activity is under the umbrella of fashion, art and activism, with sustainability and solidarity at its core. So what's the place of cultural institutions in this equation?
I found it really useful to look back at projects that have had profound effects on communities, and particularly those projects that have been carefully curated or mediated by a cultural organization, and to learn from these, and then reflecting on with whom and how the effects of what we've done have resonated. So perhaps in three areas. So from one hand, from the artist perspective, the community perspective, and the organizational perspective, and how we can measure the success of what we've done, each of us, from our different perspectives. What would be our markers of success from the artistic perspective would be that somebody builds on and takes an idea further. And perhaps this refers to the mantra of Joseph Beuys, that everybody is an artist. This means that everybody has the potential to be a creator, and we're merely supporting that person, that individual, or the communities in becoming one by providing prototypes and structures and support mechanisms that offer open-ended possibilities. And we have this saying at Studio Orta that 1 + 1 = 1,000,000. So that if everybody's doing something, no matter how small, that it all adds up. It's important that we're planting seeds and that the multiplication of these will grow into a larger force. So I think that's what I'm trying to say.
Sounds like a very beautiful image to keep in mind. I would like to ask you, what's your message as an artist to art institutions in this discourse?
My message is to be not too fearful about what we might do or not do. And also, I guess, what is there to lose today? Particularly to give space to artists, to citizens, and also to non-humans. And think about ways that you can uplift their agency. Let change rise up from the roots and somehow put that on these new pedestals that you might be thinking about building in the future.
Thank you so much for sharing your art practice and also your fascinating perspective with us. So it was a great pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.
Fighting for the climate means fighting for all people all over the world. The most famous international climate movement is called Fridays for Future. We probably all remember when the movement began, when the Swedish student Greta Thunberg staged a protest in August 2018 outside the Swedish parliament, holding the sign, "School Strike for Climate." Today, students all over the world skip Friday classes to participate in demonstrations to demand actions from political leaders. The activists' key demands are to combat climate change, to force the fossil fuel industry to switch to renewable energy.
Speaking of the Fridays for Future movement, with us today is Luisa Neubauer. She's a Berlin-based student and climate activist, known as a coordinator and speaker at the forefront of the German Fridays for Future movement. Recently, she made a public statement at the COP26 summit in Glasgow, in which she condemned the decisions negotiated there as fraud, especially as a fraud to all young people in the world who are betting on governments to care about their future. Luisa also co-authored 2 books on strategies and perspectives for overcoming the global climate crisis. So welcome, Luisa. It's really great to have you with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So actually our audience had the opportunity to hand in a couple of questions, and over the course of our conversation I will bring some of them in, and I would like to start our conversation with one question from the audience. So somebody was curious to know, who is your favorite artist?
Well, it's a big question. I feel like I like many people that I would consider artists that wouldn't call themselves artists. One, of course, a good friend of mine is Igor Levit. He's a pianist, and he has been, coming to some of the climate strikes with me. He's been playing at some of the protests. So I'm very much, of course, fond of him. But yeah, of course, there are many more. And actually, quite a few people, like many of my friends, are making music, and the theater and cinema and so on. So yeah, it's something close to my heart very much.
What exactly fascinates you of his work?
Igor's work now?
Yes.
Well, I feel Igor has, to some extent, I think very much shaped and sharpened a new understanding of political art that isn't about politics. And I think that is something that we very, very much need. We need people to use their voices. We need artists and arts to use their voices and to think not just, case by case about, changes, but about our own systemic responsibility and champion and mainstreaming radical change making.
So you engage with representatives from various spheres. I know you travel a lot, you meet many fascinating people. So what kind of encounters do you have with artistic and cultural realms?
Too few, but at least that happens from time to time again. And it's important that it's soothing, if I can say it that way, because usually, of course, the people I talk to are people in some kind of political power position, and that can be very draining. And I think it's easy to underestimate how painful these encounters are sometimes that I have with politicians and heads of states. Whereas a lot of the times that I meet people from the arts, from music and drama, and all sorts of from the entire spectrum, really, it's different because people dare to be bold, and people dare to speak their mind, and people dare to do what their gut tells them to do, and that's something that is very rare in our particular society, I feel.
So what is your personal relationship with the art world? Do you actually go to museums quite a lot?
Well, when they're open, yes, of course. And we try to actually also engage with quite a few of the exhibitions that are around. So currently there is one exhibition in southern Germany that very, very much, focuses on the Anthropocene and on climate disasters. And there's some part of it that I contributed. I was recently part of the opening of the Jewish Children's Museum in Berlin, which was a fantastic moment, and it's an incredibly exciting exhibition. I would, tell all adults really to go there. So we try to really, I try to, really think about, at least as much as I can, to think about how we can bring arts and climate together, and also what, how personal interactions can lead us there. And of course, I mean, I've been, I make music, so I've been playing music all my life long. When I was, I don't know, 4 or 5 years old, my grandmother would take me to the opera, to installations, to exhibitions, and so on. So that is, of course, some part of my life that I try to make time for as well.
Awesome.
And then I go and listen to my friends when they play in various concert places. So it's nice.
All right. So you actually touched on this a little bit already, but how extensive is the cooperation between the German Fridays for Future movement and the creative industry and art institutions?
That's a big question. I think I won't possibly touch on every aspect of that, but I think one, of course, important dimension to it is that we need, someone needs to write the soundtrack for the revolution. And so we will very much try to bring, especially music, together with our climate protests. And that works out incredibly well. So we have these really, really powerful moments when there is really masses on the streets, and then there is music giving this a vibe, giving this a sound that we very much need. And it's hopeful really to see how people are, how people dare to be moved and touched while resisting, which is so forceful sometimes. So there's something that is happening, of course, then given that there is already a connection between the climate movement and the music industry and musicians from various places, we try to, of course, speak up for music and theater when they were in need, especially, for instance, in the pandemic. So we're very much in support of all the demands, asking the cultural industry to be supported. And that is something that is very much, getting into the theater side as well by now. So actually on the weekend, I will be in Stuttgart at a theater that will focus on the ecocide questions. So we'll be speaking there, and I'm very, very happy that the climate catastrophe is getting inhaled really by different kinds of artistical expression, really. And then I would say, though, there is a big gap, and that is the question of who creates that space that we need to acknowledge the catastrophe we're in, but to also develop hope and courage for the fight against it. And I'm not yet seeing that, I think, as much as we would need it, which means we see people sliding off into climate anxiety, feeling like it's too late, feeling like there's no hope left, and people feeling isolated really by a world that they feel has let them down and that they have let down as well. And that's a very unhealthy and sad situation, I guess.
So you kind of spoke about the aspect of emotion with music in relation to those climate protests. So do you think that what kind of emotions art and musical practices evoke in people could be a relevant aspect in climate protests? So this aspect of emotion.
Yeah, it's big. I mean, it's a complex story because for a long time people have been told that the climate catastrophe is something that concerns some animals in the Arctic and possibly activists and scientists, that they are concerned with this. But it was always this kind of, when you would speak about, concerned scientists in the climate disaster, this kind of concern isn't an emotional one. It was framed as something that, scientists feel all the time concerned about something. Maybe, the research results aren't satisfying or so on. So there is some concern in the room, but it's a very bureaucratic, a very professional concern. But it wasn't sad, it wasn't despair, it wasn't, anxiety. It was always just a concern, like people being concerned about the post office closing too soon. And then it took a long time for that frame, the frame of the animals in the Arctic and the concerned scientists to be turned to something that would actually touch us. And that was, to some extent, maybe at least, when the young people, when we came up and said, hey, we're sad and we're scared and something is wrong here and we think this is your fault. And this suddenly opened up this emotional spectrum to the climate catastrophe because, children can feel everything and they can talk about their feelings and it doesn't make them unprofessional or make them look naive. It's just what children do. And so I hope, and that was really something we tried to do as well, we hope we could open those doors for adults too, for the older generations to actively think, actively reflect their emotions in the context of the climate catastrophe. And it's a tough way because for a long time, especially women, we're told, young people, you couldn't feel anything, you couldn't be moved or so on. It would be considered unprofessional or hyper-reactive or it was something that we actually needed to work towards and mainstream. And so what we needed people to cry in public about the climate. We needed people to be outraged, to scream. We needed people to dare to be emotional about something that is inherently emotional, because after all, this is about life, and it's about life and death. And, if that doesn't touch us, if that doesn't make us feel anything, then I wonder what will make us feel anything. And so by now, I think we're at a point that this is much more accessible, yet we are, of course, missing pieces. And people still feel that they can be frustrated about climate politics, but they couldn't be sad about a losing planet or a dying ecosystem. And so I think that's a path ahead, really. And we need to, against contemporary understanding of what professional politics should look like, I very much ask us to allow us to be touched by the climate disaster and to allow us to let our emotions, drive us, really. Yeah.
So this entire event series is called Art Institutions in the Age of Existential Risks. And of course, climate movements or protest movements are facing those existential risks, but also art institutions are in this moment. So I'm wondering where you think art institutions could learn from climate movements or protest movements, and where also from the other hand side they could learn from art institutions.
Well, that's a difficult question because, of course, there is a bit of an ambivalent relationship to art institutions, given that many of them, way too many, are still sponsored by the fossil fuel industry. Very prominently, some of the big museums in the UK, for instance, and that doesn't work out. We can't, we need to push fossil fuel industries back wherever they are, and we can't allow them to infiltrate the art, or to keep infiltrating the art. That is, after all, that industry that caused that suffering here, that people around the world, especially those on the front lines, are experiencing. And when we talk of values, when we talk of, democratic art, when we talk of value-based art, the fossil fuel industry shouldn't have a space there. Yeah, that's one thing. And once it is happening, though, I think the doors are open, and they should be open for people to think big. We won't solve the climate crisis, the climate disaster, with the same tools that has created it. And so we need to start being creative about things, about inventing the tools that we need. And I mean, what could be more inspiring and more necessary there than the arts in the wider sense? And on the other way around, I think when it comes to pushing back fossil fuel interests, when it comes to resisting the status quo, when it comes to questioning what is right and what is wrong, and what is inspiring thinking about the future, I think there's lots to learn from the Fridays for Future and the wider climate justice movement.
So how feasible is it for art institutions to remain independent or even neutral to the political and economic discussions on the climate crisis?
I don't think neutrality is something that works out in the climate disaster. There's no neutral space in the climate catastrophe. You're either part of the solution or you're part of the problem, and there is no in between. That's a black and white question. After all, a crisis that concerns everyone, and where everyone, emits, has no bystanders. There's no way to say this is not concerning me and I will remain neutral to this. Then you're immediately part of the machinery that drives this crisis. And I think we need to be as bold about it as that. And so I think neutrality isn't something to strive for. And I think, as soon as we understand that the climate crisis is not just, but also political, I think neutrality there isn't something that, should be something we look forward to. I think the question rather is, how do we not forget about our own values? How do we strengthen societies and democracies in an existential crisis? And that's big. And we don't have an absolute answer to that, but it's something we should look out for. And that's something we should work towards rather than neutrality.
So do you think the art world could operate as an ally of activist movements, and how so?
Oh, it must. I think it's we need to, in a time where the planet is dying and the lives on Earth are dying faster than we can recover or protect, we need to fundamentally question what we're doing and what we're working towards and what world we're working towards, most importantly. And so I think allyship is needed between everyone who works towards climate justice and everyone who can contribute to that. And I think there the world of art is very much needed. As I mentioned earlier, where are the spaces where we create a safe and just future? Where are the sounds that will drive the resistance? Where are those who allow us to feel the pain and also the hope that we need?
So the Fridays for Future movement is mostly out in public space. You go on the streets, you speak in the public realm. Do you think that such movement could also be carried and brought into an institution? Could the institution also function as a public space for deliberation and discussions?
I think there are two questions there. So can art institutions be a space for discussions? Yes, I mean, they already are, and they ideally, be more, will be more of that, especially when the pandemic is easing a bit. The second question, I think, is the question of where will change be created, inside or outside the systems. And I don't think this is an either-or question. I just believe that, systems itself, they had time, decades-long time to prevent the catastrophe we're seeing right now. But instead of doing that, they were mostly part of accelerating the crisis. So relying on the systems, that's not going to work out, given that we're facing a systemic problem. So I think, the force eventually will come from outside the systems. And then, of course, it won't be as easy as, the outside doing it alone. We then, of course, need the changes to be happening within the systems too. But that's not going to be, working out without any pressure from the outside. And so I would maybe describe it as an ecosystem of change we are seeing, where institutions, will be part of the change or will be dismantled. But all those changes will be fueled by the public rising, by the people pressuring those institutions, those systems. And that's a fuel, that's a catalyzer that's happening, that's driving this ecosystem of change. And so we need people to go out there. And maybe just one last thought to that. I think people sometimes, might get the impression that they have to make a decision. Am I in the system or am I outside the system? And that I'd imagine that feeling being very stressful. But I don't think that we have to make this decision. And I'm not even sure if we have a decision there, because of course, in some way or the other, we're all part of some systems. And sometimes we benefit from those systems when we work in an institution because we need to pay rent, when we, buy certain foods and move a certain way because we couldn't afford it any other way. We are all part of some fossil fuel system. And so waiting for the moment that we're freeing ourselves from any kind of ties to any kind of system to then, be part of the revolution, that's not going to work out. We need people to become activists, but we need to become activists straight away. So stop worrying about potential ties to any kind of things that are, that we need to overcome, as we're all part of that. But start thinking about where to join, where to go to start the change.
Yeah, actually in London or in Great Britain, several art institutions are advised by activist movements. So is this something that the Fridays for Future movement in Germany could imagine? Advising art institutions in Germany?
Oh, yeah, maybe. I'm not a big fan of taking activists' time, endlessly, because activists need that time to do activist work. And there is this tendency to kind of pull people out of the movement and put them into kind of nice seats so that they can do something, which eventually, is not half as important as the work that needs to be done in the streets. But if it works out and if people are getting paid and people, feel like that is not just some nice status symbolic action, but it's something that is meaningful, well, then I think we should all go for it.
All right. So what concrete steps would you suggest art institutions worldwide to take within the nearest decade in order to keep up fighting with globally changing narratives and to be responsive to the voices of communities?
Maybe three things. First of all is end the ties with the fossil fuel industry. We can't be sponsored. We can't, art institutions can't be sponsored by fossil fuel industries. They can't be advised by fossil fuel industries. There can't be a public space of or for fossil fuel industries. Where's your money coming from? Who's advising you? Who's on your board? These are really important questions. And if it's one thing we know about who has caused this crisis, it's the fossil fuel industries. About everything else, let's discuss that. But the fossil fuel industries, that's the Voldemort of the climate crisis, and we need to, be clear about that. Secondly, of course, we are called climate justice movement because we believe that the climate catastrophe is part of a huge and historical injustice that has happened, and we won't solve that injustice by creating more injustice, but by creating just worlds. And so I think for art institutions, the big question must always be who's in the room and who isn't, who is portrayed and who isn't, who's heard and who isn't, who has access and who hasn't. And, by thinking of a just future as something that is diverse, that is truly representative, we need to think about those things in artistic spaces as well. And finally, I think it's an important question to ask, what is it that people take away when they leave your institution, your exhibition, your museum or theater or whatever? Is it a feeling that there's a crisis out there that's solved by someone else? Is it a feeling that there maybe is no crisis? Or is it a feeling that there is a crisis and maybe we need to fight that? I think that's an important, an important question.
Is there like a final advice that you would like to give us?
I don't feel like I should. I don't feel like an advisor to the art. I mean, many people know much more about that than I do.
But to the art institution,
I would hope that we see the most beautiful and inspiring and creative revolution of all times when we overthrow the systems that have caused the climate crisis and that are interested in fueling the crisis, and that, you know, needs to happen hand in hand with the artists, with the art, really. And I don't know, in an existential crisis, we need to set up priorities, and we need to very, very honestly and critically reflect on our role in this. And we have 3 to 5 years to organize drastic emissions reductions everywhere. And that's a time span I think we need to consider now. So there's no point in waiting for something or in growing up to be something or someone. We need to do things now. And eventually we'll ask ourselves, what did we do when we were able to do things, to change things, to create a world where we can feel safe again. And yeah, that's happening now. It's out there. And so, yeah, we have no time to lose, and we have no need for yet again another institution that counts on someone else to be the change we need to see. We need to be that change ourselves by now.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful closing remark, I think. Thank you very much for taking the time and sharing your perspective. Has been fascinating.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
We already spoke about various types of activism and different causes for activist actions. However, we are also very much interested in the way activism and politics are intertwined, and the role art institutions play in this relationship. As Bayram stated, our institutions must probably become community-based instead of following hierarchical structures. They should become platforms for activists that demand for societal and political change. Something that's also very important is the practice of documentation within the sphere of activism. Documentation and journalism are key to draw attention to social injustice and political protests.
Our final guest, Franz Böhm, is precisely the person to speak on activism, politics, and the practice of documentary filmmaking in the sphere. He's an award-winning filmmaker born in Stuttgart, Germany, and currently based in London. As a representative of the young generation in the industry, Franz aims at bringing about a real social impact with his work and making the voices of various communities heard through the film medium. Following our conversation with Franz, we will watch his film Dear Future Children, in which he accompanies 3 young activists in Uganda, Chile and Hong Kong on their fight for a better future.
Our generation fights for our seat on the table. Climate change is connected to us. I started a movement to protect my future.
There is such a big divide in this country. Injustice is present in every part of our lives.
A dictatorship has nothing to do with our values. I'm not from China. I'm from Hong Kong.
It's up to us to shape the future.
It's better for my family not to know my role on the front line.
We don't risk our future by protesting on the streets. Not going on the streets will risk our future way more.
That day when I got beat up, I feel like I couldn't do that anymore.
When they shoot us right in the face.
I fear to fail.
I'm very scared that they will know my name and my family's.
We already lost so many battles. We can't risk losing this one.
I ask myself if I am the right person to lead the movement.
Being at the front line means a lot of risks.
I don't know what will happen next.
I really don't want to be the next face on this wall.
Fear is their biggest weapon against us.
People of my age stand up.
Who can change the course of history?
Through endless sacrifices, we hustle our way because this is our future.
That's only the beginning. I'll do anything for a better future. I owe this to my future children.
So welcome, Franz. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. These are very impressive and touching images that we have just seen. Could you tell us more about the background of the film? How did the idea to make a film about different activist movements come about?
First of all, thanks so much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here and to speak with you. Yes, so Dear Future Children was really based on the idea to give a clear voice to young activists all across the globe, and more specifically, to work together with them and to work together with local filmmakers, local journalists as well, to just give a very, very clear platform to their stories, their backgrounds, to learn a little bit more about their motivations. When we started the project in early 2019, we felt that there were quite a few people telling their thoughts, their opinions about young activists, but only very little projects that focused on actually listening to the people affected, to the activists themselves. So that's what we wanted to change with this project.
So in the film you focus on the Fridays for Future movement in Uganda, the protests in Chile against social inequality in the country, and the protests in Hong Kong against the Beijing influence administration. What is it that interests you in these particular movements and their people, and why must these stories be told?
First of all, I think what really struck me during the research phase is that all three movements that we are portraying in the film have a very clear democratic majority behind their core goals, behind their core interests. And it's mostly youth-led movements, youth-led protests, which are trying to make their voices heard, which are trying to gain a seat on the table. And I think it's really important that, there has been so much noise about young activism, especially in Hong Kong. And it's just important that we find someone, or it was important for us that we find someone who is from the backbone of the movement, who is, very representative for the whole movement. And we just wanted to listen to, in that case, Pepper's thoughts and opinions and feelings about her role in the movement and also the impact that activism had on her personal life. And we just wanted to make a deep dive into that.
How did you actually get in touch with the activists? How did you identify the people that you wanted to talk to?
First of all, we have been in touch with 11 protest movements all across the globe, and we're in touch with many, frontline activists, many journalists. And in the first move, we decided for the three movements that we wanted to focus on, and then we just reached out to many youth groups, NGOs, local organizations, other reporters, other filmmakers, other journalists, and try to speak with as many people as anyhow possible to try to get a very good picture and also a good alliance of people who are trying to or who are vital in enabling us to make this project in the first place.
So what was a moment on your journey when you filmed the movie that touched you the most?
There has been the moment when Abel Acuna, a good friend of Diane, also a good colleague of us, someone who we spoke to on a regular basis, died at the front line. And there was the moment when afterwards Diane came to visit the family and sort of shared grief a little bit and speak a little bit about what happened and just share their emotions. And I think for me personally, that was a moment that I will just never forget.
In those protest movements that you followed in your film, what kind of artistic practices that shaped the movement or stood at its core could you personally identify?
I mean, I would say in Chile, it has been so impressive to see all the street work, all the graffitis that are all very, very individualistic, but tell such an important story about the backgrounds of the movements itself. Sometimes these artworks tell very, very specific moments of the protests, or activists use these street graffitis, these artworks, to share their demands, to explain their demands, to share their current feelings towards the government or the movement itself. And I think that was highly impressive, especially in Chile.
Is there also music or dance included in some of those activist movements?
Sure. I mean, for example, Chile again, there is sort of the front line where Diane is working as well, where our protagonist is working. And they're protecting the so-called heart of the protests. And there, many dancers are using specific dances to, share their feelings, share their demands, and just walking and strolling through the heart of the protests always has been obviously a great joy on the one hand. Otherwise, it was, on the other hand, it was also a little bit scary, and many of them were quite desperate, which we fully understand. But yeah, dancing and singing and was certainly used to express their demands and feelings.
While producing the film, you actually had to fight against hate mails and even death threats. So how do you deal with such a situation?
I think that has been the greatest challenge for us as a film team. We were warned multiple times by different organizations that we should think very, very carefully if we really want to involve a Hong Kong protagonist in the film. And it took a few months for us to understand why. We received multiple threats, death threats, even threats against members of my family, hacking attacks against our email accounts or bank accounts, project servers and all that. Luckily, we very early on started a very extensive collaboration with students from the Harvard University in order to establish an international infrastructure that is allowing this project to be conducted safely, which is also allowing future filmmakers, or which is enabling future filmmakers to do similar projects. And we had to work really, really hard to, develop technologies and develop systems that are serving our project here and that are enabling us to do this in a safe way. I think protecting the protagonist's identity, protecting the people that we are, protecting the people that can be seen in the film was the #1 priority here.
With your film, you provided a communication platform for people from these movements. So how, in your opinion, can film, culture and art be made safe spaces for political discourse?
I think members of our team and many other filmmakers in my generation as well have a different idea, a different concept, a different vision for young cinema. We see cinema as a place for an exchange of political ideas, a place for political inspiration, a place where we can finally listen to each other. For us, it doesn't always have to be, higher, stronger, even more edgy, and come on, let's get this last catchy sentence of the protagonists and let's try to corner them a little bit. Our main goal is to be authentic and to provide a very truthful film and to support people worldwide to fully understand why these people are going to the streets in the first place. That's where we as filmmakers see our role. That's how we can serve in the best way. That is challenging because we are in competition with, perhaps other projects that are way more edgy or more radical in a way. But we believe that our concept is the right concept, and I think especially during the next few years, will work very, very hard to prove that this can work and that there is an audience for that as well.
Do you think that this concept could also be applied to art institutions that you kind of described in filmmaking right now?
I mean, I can't really speak for, my colleagues at the, let's say, for example, for photographers or other artists. We had a very interesting exchange the other day with members of the Frontline Club in London, where quite a few photographers exchanged their ideas and their motivations at the moment. And they also saw this small trend line away from, okay, let's get the most brutal photo for the, for the title page of the newspaper, more towards, okay, let's get something authentic, which is actually really representing the situation on the ground, and is not representing the 1%, which is on the very, very far right or far left or whatsoever.
Can you already give us a hint what your new film will be about?
Our new film?
Yes.
Yes, so I can definitely say that I'm repeatedly working with our producer Johannes Schubert, who was already the producer on Dear Future Children. We are very happy to extend our partnership for the next project as well. And it will tell a true story of a very, very brave journalist who uncovered, or who is still uncovering, a very current geopolitical and human catastrophe.
Thank you. I'm very excited to watch this film, and thank you very much for being with us today. So even though we will say goodbye for now, you won't leave us, but you will be present during the film screening of Dear Future Children in our YouTube comment section, and the audience will get the opportunity to ask you some questions. So thank you so much for being with us tonight, and I'm truly excited to see the movie now. Have a lovely evening.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and yeah, looking forward to hearing everyone's opinion on the film.
Today we have spoken to artists, activists and a filmmaker from various regions about the fight for a more collective, sustainable and equal world. Franz Böhm, who works as a documentary filmmaker, is drawing attention to political activism and protests worldwide. Luisa Neubauer personifies a whole revolution carrying both the fame and the blame on her back. As she said, quote, "There's no neutrality in the face of climate disaster. You are either a part of the solution or a part of the problem."
But how can art institutions actually become part of a solution? Mustafa Bayr is convinced that art institutions hold a lot of power, but most of the time present themselves as if they don't. His message to art institutions is: present more power and go away from the idea of neutrality. As Luisa Neubauer reminded us, and that's again a quote, "In the time when the planet is dying, the world of art is very much needed as a space that will drive the resistance and allow us to feel the pain and the hope that we need."
We are especially intrigued by Lucy Orta's statement that art and activism are a powerful force to create new alternatives. Therefore, art institutions can become allies of activist movements and build platforms for alternative ways of coexisting, thinking and creating the future together. So if you liked today's program, you should not miss out on the conference Institutions as a Shelter, a program that we organized together with the activists group Artists at Risk that will be on in February 2022.
Thank you very much for joining today, and it was a pleasure to host the event here at ZKM Karlsruhe. See you at the next episode of Art Institutions in the Age of Existential Risks. Goodbye and enjoy watching the movie Dear Future Children.